Welcome to a special virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Michelle Miao, member of the Board of Governors for the club. If you're just finding out about the Commonwealth Club of California, the club is the oldest and longest running public affairs forum in the country. Since COVID-19 or the pandemic, we have had to close our live audience programming, switching to an all virtual programming platform and offering these programs to you for free. So please support the work of the Commonwealth Club of California if you can by visiting commonwealthclub.org/online. Thanks so much for joining us here for our special program, Halting Bigotry in Its Track. If you're joining us online and live and on YouTube, please join in on the conversation. We want you to be engaged. And so ask questions if you have them along the way. I'll get them through this amazing iPad. It's great what technology can do these days. And so I'm pleased to introduce to you our incredible panelists. We have Judge Lillian Singh, who is the first Asian American woman judge in Northern California. Prior to being a judge, Judge Singh was a San Francisco Human Rights Commissioner, the first Asian American Vice Chair of San Francisco Civil Service Commission, and the first Asian American President of the Trustees of the San Francisco Community College. She's also been a founding member of various organizations, and we'll talk about them a little later, but she presently serves as a co-chair of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition. We also have Dr. Karen Korematsu, who's the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute and the daughter of the late civil rights icon, Fred Korematsu. Since her father's passing in 2005, Karen has carried on his legacy as a public speaker, educator, and civil rights advocate. We also have Samina Usman, who is the Government Relations Coordinator for the San Francisco Bay Area Office of the Council on American Islamic Relations. She advocates for legislation impacting civil rights, privacy protections, and an equitable society. Please welcome our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us here for the show. We'll start off slow because we have a lot to talk about, today, and we are going to halt bigotry in its tracks by the end of this hour. Share your first memory of standing up for something or for yourself. We'll begin with Dr. Karen Korematsu.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for putting together this significant program, especially during this time, and also for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May. These are important issues that we need to address, and constant battles of continuance of hate speech and violence. Actually, I was thinking about this because you said you were going to ask us this question. My first advocacy goes back to the time I was in college, and this was during the Vietnam War. So I never thought of myself then as an advocate, as a civil rights advocate, but certainly it was a war that I disagreed with having the U.S. Participate in, as many of my college colleagues. So that's my first recollection.
So for me, actually, my parents had been relatively politically active. I mean, they came to this country in the 60s when there was very few Muslims, especially in Southern California. So my parents, they were always just involved in the community. And so one of the activities that I remember, my earliest memory, was actually protesting during the Bosnian War. We wanted to make sure that there were some resources that were provided for them. And also we were helping with Bosnian refugees that were coming into the country. So that was when I was probably like a preteen or early teenager. So
my sense of justice was actually awakened during the 70s. I know Mish talked about it. I was going to say I was born with the feeling of fighting justice, but my real sense of civil rights movement actually happened during the 1970s when Professor Ling Chi Wang and I and 3 other people formed the Chinese Affirmative Action, which was really important because prior to that, people defined discrimination, civil rights in terms of black and white. We know that's not. So we formed the Chinese for Affirmative Action to tell the story of what our community is going through and has gone through these years of living in America, fighting discrimination and trying to get justice.
Well, it's an incredible honor to share space with you today to talk about this very important topic. Let's get into it. There's a long list of United States policies and incidents that would suggest the anti-Asian racism we're experiencing during this pandemic is history repeating itself. What are some examples that would explain how racism and xenophobia is deeply rooted in our history and policy making? We'll begin with Judge Singh.
Okay. Unfortunately, this country is full of history that we cannot be so proud of. This land is a land of opportunity. The American dream is what we all want to have. The American dream sometimes turns into American nightmares when this ugly head of racism and discrimination is raised. Of course, we know about what happened during the Chinese Exclusion Act, when there was a first ban on a specific group of people on the basis of race and ethnicity. And then, the families were separated, and it was just a terrible, terrible era. That time, the Chinese came as railroad workers, but then after it was over, camps were burned, looted, and 3 people that we are so proud of in San Francisco that we have named buildings and streets after turned out to be champions of the Exclusion Act. You remember Julius Kahn, Playground? Well, he was really an author of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Also, Phelan, John Phelan, who was also a champion of the Exclusion Act, and of all people, Bolt, the name of the famous law school from UC Berkeley. These 3 bad J's form were the architects of the Chinese Exclusion Act. During this time, after this, then we have this McCarthy era, where Chinese was considered to be linked with communist China. Just because the United States was against communist China, everyone who is Chinese was considered a potential threat and a spy. And that time was really ugly. I remember that very well because I was representing some people who were undocumented for years because their citizenship and their passports were taken away. These were kids during that time. But the FBI would raid these clubs. Dr. Roland Lowe, for example, was only 15 years old. He belonged to an organization called Wa Qing, where kids go and learn English, learn bilingual culture such as dance and singing. They were considered potential spies. And a lot of these kids' citizenship were taken away, and they lost and became undocumented. Dr. Roland Lowe became the first Asian American president of the California Medical Association and the first Asian American president of the San Francisco American Society. Good people were threatened and their citizenship taken away. Right now, unfortunately, Michelle, this is happening in our society at this very moment when FBI Director Christopher Wray said last week that China poses an all-out threat, to a whole society threat to the safety and security of the United States. What does that mean? A whole society threat. That means businesses, government activities, universities, everywhere. And the target is with anyone who is Chinese American is to be distrusted. This atmosphere right now, the climate of the country right now is frightening. It reminds me so much of what happened during the McCarthy era, when Chinese Americans were terrorized because of our relationship and association with the country of our birth, China.
If you're asking about, explaining xenophobia and how it's been deeply rooted in our history, honestly, it's been since before our nation's founding, with bringing over, slaves, and how that is impacted us even today. It definitely still has its absolutely horrible impact on communities today, and we still have not rectified that at all. But going a little bit further, I mean, I know that in terms of like with the Muslim community, we have seen a lot of our nation's policies, whether it be COINTELPRO attacking, communities. I mean, again, it's not just the Muslim community, obviously, but that program had some devastating consequences. Same thing, we have like the National Security Entry and Exit Registry System, which is a Bush era program that disproportionately targeted Arabs and Muslims and requiring people to register. This happened, after 9/11. The Patriot Act. I mean, the list goes on and on. Even today, we have some terrible policies and programs such as the Countering Violent Extremism Program and the Preventing Violent Extremism Program that's in the state of California. I mean, you would think that like California is a very liberal, or they would have more progressive policies, but it's not. And so, I mean, I'll go more into it a bit later. But again, with each administration, it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. You've had some dangerous and really problematic policies that have impacted communities of color especially, and that need to be rectified and that need to be overturned.
Well, we can even go further back to the beginning of this country, the start of this country, with the prejudice and the racism that was attacked against our American, Indian friends, because this is, what kind of the white man has done all these years, and then putting them in Indian reservations and taking their rights away. And there's still, many groups are even struggling, today. But our history, unfortunately, is repeated, from, as Lillian was saying, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I will say, she pointed out one person, Bolt, and fortunately, thanks to Dean Chemerinsky at UC Berkeley and Berkeley Law, that they call that name is no longer recognized. And so this is about righting a wrong, and that's what we need to continually address. So, of course, for the Japanese Americans during World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they were targeted as the cause of all that. It was the same thing as we hear today. Go back home. You don't belong here. And clearly, my father, Fred Korematsu, was one of those who said no, that he was an American citizen. He was born in this country. Why should he go to an American concentration camp when he had done nothing wrong? All due process of law was denied, and people were stripped of their homes, their possessions, and their dignity. And that's what we continually do. We try to target people's dignity and to accuse them for something that is not even their fault. But even back in 1942, they said, well, this is military necessity. Well, now we call that national security. And as Samina knows, the first group of people to speak out when the Amemsa community was being attacked, especially after 9/11 and even before that during the Gulf War, was the Japanese Americans. And this is the opportunity that we have, is at least now we have these collective groups, all these civil rights groups, that where we can stand up and say no, to people. That's why we have to say no to bigotry, that we have to stop this. And collectively, now we have the power to do that, as long as we work together and keep pushing, keep pushing forward. There's no easy answer. It's going to take all of us. It all keeps taking time, but we can't give up. It was like my father never gave up for almost 40 years, that someday he would see justice, before his federal conviction was overturned in 1983. And we just can't give up now.
Thank you. You all bring up some very important, examples and points in our history, the United States, that shows how racist our policies are. But leaders of the free world have justified these policies under the guise of national security. So a lot of these policies, we in our history, we always talk about the need to do this because it's a threat to our, country. And so that gets accepted by many people, but it doesn't talk about the impact that it has on us as Americans, on all of us. So let's discuss that in depth, because we can point out, even in a recent administrations, a lot of decisions that resulted in terrorizing the immigrant, people of color, and marginalized communities. I mean, there are a lot of examples of that, and you've already brought up some. We'll start with Samina.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've been seeing, I guess I should just focus mainly on the Muslim community. We've seen, especially after the horrific attacks of 9/11, it was used to justify surveilling and targeting Muslim communities more broadly, and also, to as I mentioned, I mean, again, one of the first policies was the NSEERS program, which is a Bush era program that required non-citizens to register when they entered the U.S. And mandated that they had regular checks on, with immigration officials. And we had that program be used in order to kick out a number of, thousands of Muslims. There was one case that really sticks with me, is when a man, he got into an accident and he was not able to make it for his regular check-in, even though he had his doctor note or hospital records or whatever. He was told, nope, you didn't make the meeting, and you're no longer allowed to stay in this country. So he was kicked out. So, I mean, again, these policies, you have these things that may happen, and then that could be used to quote unquote justify, targeting of communities. The Patriot Act, I mean, the absolute, like the surveillance efforts on, Muslim communities, and then trying to create these programs such as the Countering Violent Extremism program, where it turns communities like against each other. If people accept money for this program, they're basically spying on their communities. And so, and again, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is the statewide program, the Preventing Violent Extremism program, which we're trying to fight. We're actually, right after this call, I'm going to be testifying, in the budget committee to ensure that we're not going to be funding this type of program, because it is going to be affecting, those who are Muslim or refugees or African Americans or Latinx, claiming that they're more prone to radicalization and violence. And this is incredibly, problematic. So that's another problem. But most recently, in terms of you had the Trump administration, the very first executive order that was passed was the Muslim ban, banning, and now that has been expanded to 11 countries. And, we've seen families be torn apart because of this racist, xenophobic program, or this executive order that is tearing families apart. I mean, my kid's teacher, he had gotten married and he has not been able to be united with his wife, who's based out of Yemen. I mean, there was another case where we had a mother whose child was in the States for medical treatment, and she was not allowed to enter the country. She had a 2-year-old boy who was, on life support, and she was not able to enter the country until we had thousands of letters and elected officials, speaking out against this. And finally, she was able to come and be reunited with her son 10 days before he died. I mean, these are terrible policies that are instituted under the guise of, oh, this is national security, we need to protect our country, and what it's really doing is causing a lot of fear, a lot of mistrust, and it's tearing families apart.
Yeah, this what you said, Samina, is absolutely happening all over the United States to every ethnic community. But China is now seen as the #1 threat to the United States. So Chinese Americans are seen to be possible spies for the United States. This is what happened to Wen Ho Lee in the 1990s. He was a great scientist with the University of California and was a nuclear scientist when all of a sudden the FBI came down and charged him with 59 counts of somehow getting information to China. They never proved that. In fact, after Wen Ho Lee was arrested, the judge did not allow bail. He was put into isolation, and after all that, turned out there was nothing. There was no conviction except Wen Ho Lee pled guilty to mishandling of files related to the science work. We all mishandle our files, and yet he was sentenced to jail, denied bail, denied his liberty. That's a kind of paranoia we are going through at that time, and we're going through right now. Earlier I mentioned about the McCarthy era, and now what's happening. And I earlier mentioned about how Christopher Wray is going through this a whole society threat to the United States. China is posing a whole society threat. Means everything: business, media, science, government, education, and Chinese is to be distrusted. On top of that, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, along with Minority Leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, introduced and supported a legislation that will allow the FBI to conduct surveillances without first establishing the person has any connection or is affiliated with an international terrorist group. What does that mean? It's a threat to all of our liberties. This is not only a bad legislation for Chinese Americans, it's a bad legislation for every American in the United States. The most precious right that we have as American citizens is the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. The Constitution protects us. And yet, the head of the Democratic Party, the head of the Republican Party, who never got along, suddenly got together on this bill. This bill is dangerous. It's dangerous to all of us as American citizens, and I hope it never gets passed. But what is happening in this country right now? Minorities are considered as potential enemies of this country with no evidence whatsoever. And that's because our economy is going through so much problem right now because of the pandemic. And yet our country is not prepared for the pandemic, has nothing really to deal with it. It doesn't even have adequate testings. And they try to use scapegoating China for the problem. Scapegoating minorities is the pattern of this country. Whenever there's a crisis, they have to find somebody to blame. Chinese has been blamed during the McCarthy era, right now during the pandemic, which is especially dangerous. And there's so much hate crimes going on right now. I don't know, we all heard about what Chinese for Affirmative Action and the University of San Francisco State, SF State University, got together to form a center called the Asian American Pacific Island Hate Center to collect statistics. It started in March of 19, and already in 2 months, they got 2,000 reports of hate incidences. The hate incident actually happened to my grandson. I'm very proud of my grandson, who's just turned 18. He's a great soccer player in the state of Pennsylvania and got an all-star award, which means that he's one of the best players in Pennsylvania. I'm not very good at soccer, so I really don't really know what the exact title is, but I know he's a hero in his community and he's a hero in the state of California. He went to the bathroom during one of the soccer games, and all of a sudden the boys in the bathroom said, "Oh, don't worry, he doesn't carry COVID virus, but be careful." And poor Logan, he was born in the United States, raised in the United States. Didn't even know he was Chinese American. I hate to say that. I'm sorry, he does. But he was taken back. He didn't know how to deal with this racist comment. He didn't say anything. And it took him a long while to tell me what happened. That's what happens when you become victimized with bullying and being called names. Kids are being hurt. Kids are being affected mentally, if not physically, by these hateful assaults. We need to help our community become better communities and not allow this hate to continue. And it's a virus against this whole community. It's a physical virus, but it's a mental health as well.
Yep.
So we all are in the same boat. I don't care which race we are, unless the white race. You know, America was not founded by the white race. It's Native Americans who are really the forefathers of America in the United States. But as you say, Michelle, the history of this country is good, but there are a lot of sad histories in this country, and we need to talk about it. And I really want to thank you for bringing the subject up.
Thank you. Yes, and we'll wrap back around, you know, how do we stop it all? If we have this long history of repeating it, how do we stop it? But I do want to give Karen a chance to jump in and talk about that. You know, I think for a lot of us, even as voters, as community members, it was something scary is happening, like a pandemic, like war, like, you know, and then policies are just being floated out there as national security. You mentioned earlier, you know, an example, the Japanese internment camps. I mean, that is inhumanity disguised as national security. So we'd love for your thoughts on this.
Yes, well, and continues on. I mean, you know, as Samina was talking about separation of families, I mean, certainly, you know, with our immigration issues, that's what's happening at the border. And now, and not only that, but their health is at risk with the COVID, and that's why we're trying to get those camps closed. I'm part of a group called Suru for Solidarity that we were going to have a big march in Washington D.C. In June, beginning of June, and all the origami cranes that represents all these different people that have been separated from their families. We were going to, you know, basically stream those and reel him from the White House, and to make people aware that this, you know, as I said, we keep repeating the same mistakes. We marginalize, we separate, we you know, we are attacking you know, individuals and groups. I mean, it goes on and on. Even the fact that before even my father's case in June 1982, Vincent Chin was beaten brutally and killed because the Japanese car industry was doing so well that in Detroit, Michigan, especially where we have our auto industry, these three guys thought Vincent was Japanese, and they were, because they lost their jobs, they were accusing him and beating him for their loss. So this is kind of that you know, it's this hate violence, the hate rhetoric just continues to ramp up, especially when we in this country are in times of crisis. The problem has always been there, right, as we have talked about. But when we have this kind of crisis, then it's magnified. But now that it's magnified, we all need to collectively say, okay, what are we going to do to educate people? Because that's really our most powerful weapon. I mean, I do that through the Korematsu Institute in trying to teach students about moral principles, about courage, about respect that we seem to have lost in this country. And so that's, one of the things that we've been promoting is especially this Hollaback bystander intervention seminars that where you can learn how to, because it's scary, as the judge was saying, her grandson was afraid to say something. Well, I can tell you, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and around December 7th, when I was growing up, would blame me for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? It's your fault for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Go back to where you come from. And, we're still hearing that today. So this is the same negative rhetoric that continues from one generation to another. And this is why we need to make people accountable for their words and the rule of law.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Before I ask you the next question, I think I want to read some comments from our audience. Thank you so much for submitting these. And again, please be engaged. Please send us your questions and we'll read them throughout for our panelists. And send us comments. We like those too. But these comments are great to set up the next question. There's a comment from an audience member who says, the blame on China for COVID-19 is based on false allegations of lying and cover-up. Unsubstantiated accusations are repeated over and over until the false accusations become accepted as fact. There's another comment. To effectively halt bigotry requires putting a stop to the McCarthyite Red Scare hysteria being promoted by both Democrats and Republicans. The CCP is responsible for COVID-19, not Asians. And then another comment, ethnicities do not cause viruses, and placing blame on any region has real measurable impacts. Over 1,800 incidents of anti-Asian acts since mid-March. Let's fix the problem, not the blame. And so I think that's a good setup for, where we're at today, and you all are leading us there. Let's talk about what's happening right now during this pandemic. The president and his administration continue to talk about the virus, COVID-19, as if it's a foreign attack, that it originated from China, that the administration, his administration also casually talks about investigating labs in Wuhan with the idea that China created the pandemic, that it's coupled with, political tensions. This is all happening right now at the same time that there are political tensions between the United States and China. So how has the United States and China relationship impacted Chinese Americans and all Americans, really, Americans of color and different ethnic backgrounds? How has it contributed to increased violence and racism against the Asian American community, including the AMEMSA community? And so we'll begin with Karen.
Back in 1983, when my father's federal conviction was overturned, one of the after going through a report about the War Relocation Authority and how they were treating the Japanese Americans that were in incarceration camps, one of the results of that was lack of political leadership, and clearly that's what we're seeing now. As a lack of political leadership, that just kind of feeds the the circumstances and where facts are not even correct. This is the problem: is when you have leadership that comes out of the White House and the facts aren't correct. A lot of people, unfortunately, believe them. You think this is a leader that's supposed to know the facts, and so people believe them, and they're not. That's why it takes all of us to to say, no, these are not the facts. That we have to be accountable for our actions, and clearly. There's a lot of research as far as the COVID goes that needs to be done. Even Governor Cuomo said, well, he was impacted, but those were from people that came over from Europe. Well, I mean, so they still don't know, and it's always as the judge was saying, finding scapegoatings, finding somebody to blame, and our policies need to be changed so that we aren't in these positions again. And the one thing that I will say, take this opportunity, is to make sure everyone fills out the census, because the census is very important for the future of our country. That only happens every 10 years, and now is the time, because we need to be sure we have the services that our communities need, and that the political leadership is going to be in place through representation, and also to vote, because the way we can make a difference, people get very complacent, and voting is so important. So I'm so amazed that even high school kids are out there, especially, before the COVID, and everybody was shut down, trying to get out there in the community and to educate people about the importance of voting, and trying to even pre-vote. So, and also because we have to watch this danger of the mail ballot issue, because clearly we're hearing some of that, that they don't, that the White House doesn't want mail out ballots, and then our postal system gets attacked. So these are, there are a lot of layers and problems. I mean, we've got more problems we could string from the West Coast to the East Coast, and back again. But we all need, the way to make a difference is we did just a little bit, right? To speak up, just to do a little bit, to get your friends to vote, to help to, if you have policies, if you have to have petitions to change policies, to make sure that everyone signs these petitions so that we can make these changes. But collectively, if we just sit back and go, oh, someone else is going to do it, then we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes from generation to generation.
I know, Judge Singh, you have a whole lot to say about the current United States-China tension and how it's impacted all of us here in America.
True, Michelle. Everything Karen says, I adopt. I'd like to go into United States foreign policies, especially U.S.-China relationships. Last year we celebrated 40 years anniversary of China-U.S. official diplomacy when the United States recognized the One China policy. 40 years later, this week, what did the Trump administration do? Congratulated Taiwan's president for her inauguration for her second term. As if, and Pompeo is doing that deliberately to antagonize China. The United States really wants a war with China. That's what I'm afraid of. It is terrible what the United States is doing to China. I was so happy as a Chinese American when in 1979, the United States and China got together, and both countries prospered. So many cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, economic exchanges. Both countries benefited. Right now, with this problem between the United States and China, the tension is really, really high. And I don't know with a president like Trump there, who has a thumb that could let off a nuclear bomb anytime. And this is a guy who said that he's taking hydroxychloroquine for preventing this virus, when science, medicine clearly says it is not. And this president is leading by very, very bad example. His lies about this China virus, Wuhan virus, is really causing people to have hate towards Chinese Americans in this country and all over the world. Recently, there was a text on the internet by a guy who was dressed in a hazmat suit. And he said, I want to go out and get some Chinamen. That is so dangerous. It's like lynching the African Americans during horrible times. This kind of lies reminds me of what happened in World War II in Germany. The famous, big lie, if you tell it often enough, people will believe it. And a lot of people are believing it in the United States. People believe that China must be responsible for this virus. And I really hope that this pivot to Asia that was started by the Obama administration when Obama tried to change security and military power from Middle East to Asia and only really to China because the United States was threatened by economic growth and how well China was doing and is still doing. China is no longer the sick man of Asia. China no longer will take all this assault and insult from the Western countries. China has to stand up. And I'm proud that China is standing up because China has been so much damaged during the war and so forth. And right now, the United States and China need to get back together. They need to have a US-China friendship and need to work together to solve the world problems like this pandemic. We cannot split up. Trump is blaming China. Trump is making all these accusations with no facts, no basis at all. And yet people are believing it and good people are being hurt. So again, Michelle, I'm really worried about the security of our country getting into war with China because the United States is blaming China for everything and people are believing it. Unfortunately, they're blaming China for the unemployment rate that's so high. They're blaming China for the health problems of the over 90,000 people that died since the pandemic started. They're blaming China for unemployment rates. That's what happened in Michigan when Vincent Chin was murdered because of the high unemployment rate in the auto industries. So all this is happening, and I think if we have a U.S.-China policy that is good, things will get much better. Unfortunately, under the Trump administration, it's getting worse and worse and worse.
Samina, would you like to add anything to that, especially around, foreign relation and policies, and also how it's also impacted the Arab and Muslim communities as the anti-Asian racism has increased during this time? Would love to hear your thoughts on how it's also impacted the MEMSA community.
I mean, well, honestly, it's been at the brink of war with so many nations in this past few years, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be, whether it be Iran. That was another big concern for communities over here because, we can't, the rhetoric of our president is so damaging and it has consequences and it could potentially lead us into another war. And that's absolutely something that we do not want to have. It's easier to scapegoat the other rather than take a good look at ourselves and look at what we've been doing, whether it be the economy, whether it be, the way that we, our response to this whole COVID crisis, whether it be, the preparing, because honestly, we were truly unprepared for this whole crisis, this whole pandemic. And it begins with, the letting go of key people in the administration who were in charge of a response for if anything like this were to happen. So, it really begins with our leadership. It begins with, our priorities, because I feel as though we have not been prioritizing, looking at how our policies and our actions are impacting ourselves. I'm sure that this whole pandemic is going to be, used in order. I feel like without the pandemic, our economy was going to be messed up, regardless, because of the different tax breaks or whatnot. And we can go into that, but that would probably take over this whole show. But the thing is that we were going to be facing some issues regardless, and so with this pandemic, it's easier to blame that and to blame the other for the cause of the pandemic, and which is leading to these hate incidences and hate crimes that are happening against Asian communities. And then we're also seeing that, I think that because people have been in shelter in place, have a lot of, unfortunately, time on their hands and have been, using that time to, attack others, whether it be through hate incidences. I mean, I know that, we've seen with the Muslim community, we've seen numerous mosques being vandalized in Charleston and Salt Lake City, in Minneapolis, and also we've seen a Missouri mosque that was set on fire. And again, a couple of them had happened right around the time of the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan. So as Muslims were set to, to take part in their fast, they're now rebuilding these mosques, and it's really it's terrible to go and attack the other. We've also seen incidences where Muslim leaders have had, when they're taking part in Zoom calls, because now, of course, obviously all the mosques are shut down, and so they've changed their programming to be remotely, and we've seen numerous Muslim leaders have their Zoom calls be bombed with terrible images, whether it be child pornography or images of 9/11, the Twin Towers, or attacks on like our prophet. And so you're seeing these type of hateful attacks happening not only with the Muslim community. I've seen I've heard of other people of color who've had racist terrible images being shown, whether it be the swastika or like a cross burning or whatnot. So we are seeing an increase in attacks against a number of communities of color, but especially definitely the Asian American communities.
I think all three of you might agree with me with this assessment. I mean, to me, these types of policies, the power, the history of racism and xenophobia of the United States have kept many of our vulnerable communities marginalized, and also just that, vulnerable. And so when something as big as a pandemic happens, it's no surprise that our most vulnerable communities are the ones that are greatly impacted, which means low income, working class, our elder communities, people with health issues. Looking at COVID in America, we know that it's a significant or a disproportionate percentage of African Americans who have died of COVID-19. And just read an article in San Francisco, over 50% of those who have passed due to COVID-19 are Asian Americans. And so that kind of, brings me to the last 15 minutes of our program in talking about, we know that history repeats itself because these policies keep changing. And even today, those policies are being accepted and passed at a really fast rate and almost in an unconstitutional way, where there's checks and balances are thrown out the window. Some of it is kind of sneaking through, especially around surveillance, around national security. So we've made a lot of those points in our talk. Now is the question of, while it may feel like there is an overarching power and we feel almost powerless even during a pandemic, there are things that we need to do and there are things that we shouldn't do. So I'm almost going to ask them, together, because I know that those were the two last questions of the program. But I love that even in our preliminary talk, you brought up, one of the things not to do is to step into what I call a bomb, a trap of, showing what patriotism to this country means. So we'll start there, what not to do, and then end with some things that we can do, and we will halt bigotry in its tracks. Lillian, Judge Singh.
Yeah, we should not do what Andrew Yang tells people to do. He says, I quote him, let's show everyone how American we can be. We can never do that. We need to identify ourselves. We cannot allow the white America to define us, and the white America will never accept us. We can never be more American than what we are now. So what does that mean? I mean, during the McCarthy era, that's what parents did. They didn't teach them Chinese. They didn't want the children to know about Chinese culture because they want to remove Chineseness from them as if they can. Our race is on our faces. We can never be what white Americans are, and we should not be, because we're very proud of our culture. And therefore, we need to tell people like my grandson, who is really 6'3", by the way. He was not afraid to talk about it or to handle these people, but he just didn't know what to do. He was so shocked. But Gary Locke was born in the United States. His father served in the war and was in Normandy. He was depicted by Trump administration as if he were a Chinese official. At that time, he was serving as a U.S. ambassador to China. Trump was trying to attack Biden as to who is less patriotic to the United States and leaning towards China. So they picked somebody like Gary Locke, depicting him as if he were a Chinese official. That was so insulting. That's why Andrew Yang can never win with his "let's be more American" or "let's try to show people how American we are." Gary Locke is the most American successful story you ask for. 2 times governor of the state of Washington, U.S. ambassador to China, and yet he is seen as a foreigner. So we need to define our own history. We need to learn from our history, and we should never allow people to define us. That's what I think we should not do. What we should do is what Karen is saying and what we've all been talking about. Let's know about our history. Let's make sure we educate the public about who we are, what is the history of the United States in terms of racism and sexism, and let's hope to work together to prevent these kind of things from happening again. Unfortunately, in this country, history seems to repeat itself over and over again, but we cannot give up.
I'm going to add 2 questions from our audience. Thank you so much for submitting them, because I think that will add to your answers for my question, which is, these narratives are truly appreciated. How can we as individuals or our students for educators make a real impact in halting bigotry, ways to engage in activism, and also how do we encourage more Asians to be politically active and push back? Being silent hasn't helped. And I think that, both of those points would be made in your answers. We'll go to Karen.
Well, the one thing that we don't want to do is be complacent. We just can't accept that we each being an American is to participate. That's what a true American does. And like I said, just even a little bit. And it's, people get scared, and everyone understands that, especially when your ethnicity is the one that's being attacked, right? You're afraid to say anything. But if you don't think you have to do this alone, try to partner with someone else. And other groups need to partner with each other. That's the advantage that we have now. So like the MEMSA community partners with the Japanese American community, and the Chinese American community, will partner with the African American community. I mean, the Latino community, we all need to work together collectively. But people do get afraid, individually. And that's why, like, I'm promoting this bystander participation and training through Hollaback, because then you can learn what you can do. You can stand in front of somebody who's being attacked and kind of prevent someone from being attacked, as verbally type of thing. I mean, violence is one thing. That's something that we want to certainly not. We want to stay away from, but to kind of distract and help people that way, and just say no, you can't say that. That's not acceptable. People a lot of times are in themselves afraid to say no, and when they hear this hateful rhetoric, just say no. That's not acceptable. That's not the way that Americans should be talking, and then throw it back to what it is to be an American. Because we all have that responsibility to uphold our democracy, uphold our civil liberties and the Constitution and our human rights, and to protect each other's human rights. So it's we have to really figure out a way to do this collectively and it's a give and take. It's no one's got this perfect formula, unfortunately. We all would like to be able to have just this magic wand and go poof. It's all going to be, it's all going to, all going to change. But we know through history that it hasn't. But as Judge Singh was saying, this is why, for teachers, this is why teaching the history of our country, like that, people don't even realize the different layers of the Japanese American incarceration of World War II. They think they know, but they don't. They don't know the separation of families. They don't know that people lost everything, their possessions. They don't know that when they were released from a prison camp, they were only given $25 in a bus ticket. They don't know that these conditions were inhumane, that people had to live in horse stalls, and there was manure, and there was, all those types of things, the in-depth history of everyone. And what people can do is, especially young people, I tell them, know your own story. What was your family's story of struggle to come to this country, other than our American, Indian friends? Everyone came from someplace else. No one just sprouted up from the ground. And everyone has a story that we need to share, because, prejudice is ignorance. And the only way we can fight that, and it sounds very simple, is education. And we need to share each other's stories, like having Samina be having the backdrop of her mosque. I mean, it's like, oh wow, I want to learn more. It's inviting. We need to share the cultures, because that's what America's about, is our different cultures that we need to celebrate. That's why we have Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. For different months for Latinos and for African Americans. And, this is an opportunity to really celebrate who we are collectively as Americans.
Absolutely. I completely agree with Karen. Education is absolutely key. And that's why we're pushing for ethnic studies programs to be in, high schools, to be taught in high schools, or even earlier than that. Because, I think that there's so much, even though we're in the Bay Area, we think, okay, it's, inclusive, progressive, diverse, but we still have hate incidences right here in the Bay Area. And we have it. Can you imagine, how it's like in other parts of the state of California? So that's why it's incredibly important to have a robust ethnic studies program. And we're really pushing to include an Arab American curriculum that would be incorporated with teaching the Asian American studies as well, where there's been a fight against that, and so we're trying to push that and make sure that Arab American studies is incorporated within this program, and it's important to know that. And as Karen said, that's why it's important to just a step back. We are seeing hate incidences in high schools, or in schools in general. CARE does a study, or does a survey every other year, where we survey thousands of students to ask them, or hundreds of thousands, whatever. Last year was 1,500 students. Ask them what their experiences are in schools, and we found that the number of hate incidences against Muslim students were twice the national average. And what's really concerning is that you have also teachers who are bullying students as well. And so if you have it coming from teachers, that really sends a signal that it's almost okay for other students to engage in this type of bullying. And so it's important to have that education. It's important also to have people feel comfortable to come out and report these type of incidences. When I was doing a session, or I was doing a speech with high schoolers, and I was asking what their experiences are in school, they're like, oh yeah, no, I've never been bullied. And then when I asked them some more questions, I'm like, okay, have somebody mentioned, oh yeah, I was called a terrorist. And I'm like, and then pretty much everybody in that group said that they were called a terrorist. So it's almost as though they have internalized this and said, okay, well, this is okay, it's not a big deal. But in reality, once we had this discussion, they realized, yes, I have been bullied. And so, even though we put together an annual report, that is definitely not reflective of what's happening. And so we want to encourage people to, speak out, to report things, whether it be, to law enforcement, or whether it be to community organizations such as CARE, in order for us to keep track of these hate incidences. Because if we don't have that information, we're not going to be able to make any legislative changes at all. And so again, what Karen was saying is that, we need to celebrate each other's cultures and each other's identities. And in 2016, Assemblymember Quirk introduced Muslim Appreciation and Awareness Month, and we've been having that going. And this is August. We've been having this going, ever since. But even then, when he did introduce this resolution, he received death threats. I mean, come on, death threats for trying to recognize the contributions of American Muslims. And so, it's important for us to recognize each other's cultures, to recognize each other, what we brought to this country, and how we've made, the fabric of this country. And as Karen said, that we need to work together. We have to build coalitions, and that's what we've been trying to do, is build coalitions with other groups and other communities. Because again, if somebody is going to have a racist or bigoted view, or some attacks, one group, they most likely have those bigoted, racist, xenophobic views on other groups as well. And so, we have to stand together. We have to defend each other, and that's the only way that we're going to be able to elevate each other, is because we're only stronger together. So.
That's incredible, and a great point to end our program. Sadly, an hour is already up. Isn't that, I always want more. I want to do like 2-3 hour programs, but we'll talk about that later. Samina, very quick before we end though, there is a question out there for you. An audience member loves your backdrop and wants to know exactly where that is.
This is actually a mosque in Shiraz that's in Iran. I would love to, the architecture in Iran is incredible, but I don't think I'm going to be able to go anytime soon. But yeah, I always do like to change up the backgrounds, because there's so much beautiful architecture in the Muslim world. My favorites are in Turkey, or even there's a mosque in Pakistan where my family's from, a mosque made of mirrors, and like the beautiful mirrors around. When my parents went to travel to China, there was a mosque that had carvings of the Holy Quran in wood panels throughout all the walls that were covered. They had the inscriptions of the Quran, and actually the whole Quran was written out in there. So it's beautiful. But unfortunately, mosques in China are being destroyed. But I pray that one day we'll be able to go and visit, and that all of our communities are protected and safe.
Yeah, let's pray for each other. And also a round of applause for our amazing panelists. If you're there watching at home, your office, wherever you are, Dr. Karen Korematsu, Samina Usman, and Judge Lillian Singh. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us for this very important program. We have more programming coming up. You can check commonwealthclub.org/online for our full schedule. And remember, please help us. Please support the work of the club and our mission to find the truth by donating, if you can, at commonwealthclub.org/online. We'll see you next time.